Hey all, it's a Saturday, it's the 9th of April, and today I just want to talk to you about our times. I'm not talking about CRISPR or shares or anything. This is a philosophical discussion. I'm going to keep it brief, and I would like to look forward to your feedback of what you think is happening. So I'm looking at the question of what is wrong with us right now, and it starts with inflation and political uncertainty. Wherever you are, whether you're in the US or you're in Europe or anywhere else, right now the situation is such that everyone is suffering from inflation, and everywhere there is a lot of political uncertainty, many of it coming from the Russia-Ukraine war that is going on right now, underpinned by the previous instabilities we had, like the conflict in Syria, the aftermath of the Iraq invasion, and all those things. All of that is together at the background, over and above all the Fed interest rate hikes that we are going to expect going forward, the supply chain bottleneck and everything. The inflation pain is especially the one which is a catalyst that's going to force many governments to do stuff in a knee-jerk reaction basis. When inflation occurs, the ordinary man feels the pain because their wallet no longer can support purchase of everything that they need for their basic existence. The cost of gas has gone up. Cost of food is also going up, and due to supply chain, there is empty shelves here and there for various commodities. That's also hurting the common man. And the politicians are very, very sensitive to an unhappy populace because they have been elected by the common man. So they have to be responsive, at least they have to be seen to be responsive to the common man. So they would try to do something or the other to support the common man. And some of the things that can be easily done in the US presidential system is the Defense Act, which can allow production of critical items in a larger quantity and thereby reduce the inflation pressures. And it was most recently used, the Defense Production Act was most recently used with COVID to produce masks. That was an example of what the government did to respond to heavy pressures. Similar things can be done in order to address the inflation. The other thing that the government could do is to give some money to people or give some tax cuts. But those kind of things need approval from the Congress. And when anything goes to Congress, we have seen that it literally dies there because one party doesn't want the other party to succeed, and their ideologies are opposed. So the amount of things that a president can do is limited, and he's already done stuff like releasing oil from the strategic reserves in order to cool down the inflation on the oil prices, and that's the best he could do at that point of time. The other things that they have already done is to improve the processing at the ports, so that all the ships that have been stranded out there for a while are processed much faster, and the goods can come to the shelf much faster. That's what they could do. But the question is, how did we end up in this kind of a situation? What is it that led us into this situation where we are facing the rise of autocratic governments, the political uncertainty? Even a well-governed country like US is now facing a lot of political uncertainty. What is it that brought us to this situation? I think one of the sources was the trickle-down economics. Now, I'm going to explain this whole thing from the root, the way I understand it. And many of you may have contrary opinions, and that is most welcome because there needs to be a discourse of that. And as long as all the comments are respectful on both sides, it's always welcome. We just want to have a civil conversation. When the US started off to become a country, at that point of time, everyone was taking care of their own requirements. People used to have their own guns to protect themselves, and they would build their own cottages, they would build their own farms, and they would sustain themselves. And things kept on evolving, and then we had the formation of a government. So the whole instinct of wanting to be responsible for one's own self, the greater personal accountability is rooted there. The ability to defend oneself with their own arms and ammunition is rooted in the history of the nation, where people were defending their territories and defending their homes using guns, and they were also defending their livestock from wild animals. So that's where all those things are rooted. So those are all separate. Everybody has got their own ideologies, and that has to be respected. But what happened was initially in the smaller towns, everything was run by mom and pop stores and everyone was dependent on each other. Everybody knew each other. And in that kind of a situation, what used to happen was people are sympathetic of each other's situations and problems, and they would help each other. There was a good amount of bartering that was going on, bartering of labor to help each other. And people understood that everyone had to make a little bit of profit in order to improve their lives and provide for their children. So it was all growing well. And then we came across the concept of forming corporations. Like a company can do much bigger and better business than small mom and pop stores. And they could not only do business in the town, but they could do business in a couple of adjoining towns and do much better. And for that, they needed more capital and they needed to operate on a bigger scale. And therefore, there were entrepreneurs, the private companies where the mom and pop stores would invest in. And those companies hired people and started selling the goods in different places in adjacent towns and other places. And as a result, what happened was there was more prosperity and more people got goods that they never used to get before because it was a specialty of a particular town. Now it was available in their own town. And the skills were passed on. And it was good for a certain extent. But as this trend started increasing, instead of companies just dealing with adjacent towns, they wanted to deal across the state or the province. And they grew bigger and bigger. And as they became bigger, the CEO or the person who is managing the company or the entrepreneur or the businessman became more and more distant. He was cocooned in his glass cabin, and people had to take permission to go and meet him because he was very busy and he had a lot of things to do. He was busy managing the enterprise. So the ability of the owner of the business to relate to the common man started getting to be less and less. And most of the mom and pop stores now had competition from this corporation, and many of them become employees of the corporation, bringing their skills with them, whether as bakers or whether as hairdressers or confectioners or cobblers or ironsmiths, whatever it may be. They all went into employment. And when they went into employment, they were all fellow employees and they would work 9 to 5 and go home. And the kind of interdependence that they had with each other when they were mom and pop stores, that kind of dissolved over a period of time. They were just employees, and they were taking their salary and taking care of their family, and they didn't have much invested in the other fellow employee next to them, except for the ones who were in their small division. They didn't care about the people who are outside. So slowly empathy started dissolving in the economy, in my opinion. Around this time, employers, companies, or CEOs discovered that employees were indispensable. If they lost an employee to a competitor, then what would happen is it would disrupt their production. And if the employee had some critical skills, then it would definitely impact the profits. In order to avoid that, what the companies decided to do was that they would value the employees much better. They offered them defined benefit pension plans. The defined benefit pension plan assured the employee that if they spend their lifetime working for this company, when they retire at the age of 55 at that time, they would be able to get a portion of their salary, maybe 70% of their salary on a monthly basis, and also medical and other benefits until they die. So that benefit was given, and that was called as the defined benefit pension, and that enabled to retain employees. And it was also called as a golden handcuff, because once employees spent a certain number of years in a company and their defined benefit pension was vested, they would not leave the company until they retired. So once the employee was snared in that situation, then their increments, salary increments and bonuses could be moderated, and still the employer may not lose the employee. So that's how things were working until the advent of the Industrial Revolution. Adam Smith came up with a lot of theories that helped industrialize production with humans, and using each human as a machine, where each person was just supposed to do one part. So earlier, when a baker was running a mom and pop store bakery, he or she was able to do everything right from milling the grains to making the dough, proofing the dough, putting it into the oven, making the bread and displaying it in the counter and showing and selling it to people. The whole thing was known, the whole science was known to that person. And their apprentices also learned the entire thing. But now with Adam Smith's theory, division of labor, coming into focus, the aim was to standardize the end product and was to make the production more efficient. So we now had situations where in a bakery, one person was just responsible for milling the grains and coming up with flour of the best quality, and another was just responsible for creating the dough. Yet another was responsible only for putting it into the oven and taking it out, and someone else was responsible for marketing and selling. So the division of labor made people specialists in a very niche area without a comprehensive knowledge of how the entire product comes. And over a generation, baking kind of became something that was a hobby, and people had to go to baking classes to learn how to bake bread at home. It was more convenient for people to just go to the shop and buy bread, and their breakfast was done. So this kind of changed the whole societal relationships, because now the CEO found, or the owner of the business found, that the employees were not indispensable. And he also found out that the employees had niche knowledge, so they couldn't be confident of completing any product by themselves. So there was a bit of insecurity for each employee. So they decided this was the opportune time to take away the defined benefit pension plan and put in place a defined contribution pension plan. So earlier in the defined benefit pension plan, the businessman or the company had to put aside money to provide for the old age of the retiring employees and for their medical care and everything. And they had to make sure that the money that they put away was able to earn sufficient returns in order to catch up with inflation and still provide the quality of facilities that was promised in the defined benefit plan. Now with defined contribution, they outsourced that entire responsibility to the employee. So now the employee was just required to contribute from their salary a certain percentage of money that will go into a pension fund, and the pension fund will accumulate the money, and it will be paid back at the end of the period to the employee. And during the time that it remains in the pension fund, it will be invested in mutual funds or shares of the choice of the employee. Now the employee was bearing the risk. So if those assets lost value, the employee may as well have worked for the company for a lifetime and not found the benefits that he needed if the shares in his pension fund did not perform well. So that happened, and as a result of which, many of those employees which were loyal to the company started leaving the company, and many decided to become independent contractors. And that's how precarious employment started, where people started invoicing the company for their services and decided to take matters into their own hands. And companies found it advantageous because now they can hire and fire at will, and they didn't have to provide for many of the facilities that they would have had to provide for regular employees, and thereby reducing their employment costs. Now, the CEO of these companies were very rich people. They were paid handsomely. And most of the shareholders, which was common people like us, earlier owners of mom and pop stores who bought shares, they wanted dividends on their shares to supplement their salary income, and they were looking for more dividends. And as a result, they were able to pay CEOs who were giving them more dividends, much better salaries. And this enabled CEOs to be much more focused on generating profits, because that is what ensured that they would be employed and paid better salaries. So they started focusing on cutting costs in order to increase profits, because if they increase the sales price, people are not buying their products. So they wanted to keep the sales price where it was and increase the profits. So they had to reduce the costs. So this started happening by improving production techniques, first by division of labor, specialization, and then by introduction of machines. Increasing profits apart from division of labor was facilitated by the advent of industrialization, where industrial machines were created. And many business owners decided to use mechanization, as I would call it, to improve the productivity. So as they brought machines into the factory floor, now machines could make the dough, machines could bake and control the timing, so they don't need people to be attentive to the machines. So all of these things started happening, and the companies were able to let go of employees and replace them with machines, not at a very high scale, but at a decent enough scale. But it was not significant for people to start feeling unemployment. More and more of these machines started coming into factory floors, and there was lesser employees involved in producing same or more products than before, and that allowed the corporation to be more profitable, and the shareholders started feeling that there was more profits available to their pockets, and they were happy. And this created a whole breed of people who just lived off profits from their investment in shares. This bred a class of investors who would not work in companies or anything, but they would just invest capital in companies and demand that the CEO create returns. This class of investor was a professional investor, and they started taking keen interest in the quality of work the CEO performs, and therefore there was more pressure on the CEO to deliver profitability. And the CEO started cutting costs. And one of the opportunities for them came in terms of outsourcing. So it was discovered that if you send manufacturing to a place like China, the worker in China would probably take 1/10 of the salary to do the same job that an American worker would do. So many of these CEOs decided to outsource their work abroad, the manufacturing work. And initially, China got a lot of wealth from the US because jobs started flowing into China, because the Chinese worker now was able to get a job and start working while the Americans were losing their jobs. And the job loss did not come to impact the people that much, because most of these people were employed in other companies which are also starting to outsource, and the incoming product was much cheaper, and they would still afford the same standard of living, and the workers were still getting the same quality of life and standard of living with these products, and it didn't create much of a social problem at that time. But as more and more outsourcing started happening, people started losing job in the manufacturing sector in most of the developed countries. And those people were all absorbed into service sector, and software sector was coming up. And many educated people found jobs in software sector, and also families learned the value of education. And many of the children got educated, and they got jobs in the service sector doing marketing, franchising, and medicine, and all those areas. And also banking also started growing up as a field of employment with multiple branches all over the place. And this trend continued until outsourcing of services started, and countries like India and Ireland benefited from the outsourcing of services. We had situations where, unfortunately, a lot of American workers had to train their offshore counterparts only to lose their job and get a pink slip once the training was completed. And many companies outsource their entire R&D departments to countries like India and Ireland when it comes to software and hardware technology, as well as medical research. So all the English-speaking countries which had lower salaries and had highly educated population received all the R&D and software and research outsourcing. And even now, when you look at most of the business articles that you see in many leading publications, you will find an Indian or an Irish name, because most of the article is written out there, and it comes here and gets into the magazine or websites of leading publications. So this is what is happening. And as a result of this, people are really, really unhappy with the governments. Now the question is, how did this happen? And the answer for that is that the single-minded pursuit for profits led all the popular investor class to push for CEOs that would deliver profits. And the CEOs in the quest for profits were much disconnected from the ordinary people, because they were now living in their ivory towers with their high salaries and a high quality of life. They ruthlessly cut employment. They took decisions that were contrary to the ordinary people. And when the ordinary people started protesting and started complaining to companies, and they started funding politicians by lobbying them and getting favorable legislation passed, which was contrary to the interests of the common man, but more in the interest of the corporations. And when people started complaining about that, the corporations came up with, along with the politicians, came up with another brilliant plan that was coming with PACs, political action committees. And political action committees could collect monies from various sources and work in parallel with the politician to get them elected by spending on ads and everything. And these ads started shaping the opinion of people, and people voted contrary to their own interests. And when the politicians came to power, they found that the politicians were not delivering any legislation that would benefit them. Instead, all the legislation was being in the benefit of corporations. And this also was the point of time where the term trickle-down economics came to play. Politicians justified it by saying that the companies generate employment and the rich people invest in companies, and if they get all the benefits, they are in a bigger and better position to generate a lot of employment, and the wealth will flow and trickle down to the common person, and they can all have a great life. And this story held on for a while, and great tax cuts were given to businesses and industries and the billionaires who form 1% of the population and control a lot of assets. And income inequality started increasing. And when that became a problem, the Supreme Court delivered a big benefit to the corporations and the politicians with the decision on Citizens United. Now, political action committees, though they require to disclose the source of their money, were able to avoid disclosing the exact source of the money because there were dark organizations which could pull the money from various donors and then give it to the political action committee. And the donors to the dark corporations would not be known. And you had the ability to form corporations which will not disclose the owners in various jurisdictions within USA and abroad. But for the sake of political contribution, these companies have to be domiciled in the US. And there are a lot of corporate havens where you can form shell companies which do not disclose the beneficial owner of those companies. But having channeled the money into the political action committee, those donors were able to tell the political action committee what agenda that they should support and pursue, and they would select those politicians to support which were aligned with those ideas. And politicians were also pliable, and they decided to sell their political future to champion the cause of these political action committees. And that's the reason why we are in the situation that we are in. There's a growing influence of big business on government, and government legislation is more in favor of businesses and billionaires than that of people who are electing them. And the growth of autocrats and banana republics is happening across the globe because all of these rich people who have already made a lot of money still want more money. And that cannot be satisfied unless they have absolute control over the government, and they need not come to us for election year after year. And that is achieved by having an autocracy or a banana republic where a person can rule the government with impunity without having to go through elections. And you see those kind of government in most places. And in those countries, what happens is the citizens feel like the government is their overlord, and they have to be subservient, and they have to toe the line of the government in order to get the basic benefits like a passport or peaceful possession of their property. Property rights can change at the whim of the government. So those kind of things happen in autocratic and banana republics. And when people lose faith, or they are misled by advertisement and opinion media into voting for causes which are antithetical to their own benefits, we devolve into an autocracy or a banana republic and lose all our freedoms and our ability as citizens to govern our own future and have a better future and aspire for greater and greater growth for us and our family in a thriving economy with freedom of expression, freedom of speech, and everything. All of that will get squished when you get into an autocratic setup. So the question then becomes, what can we do about it? So I think that the most important aspect is that each one of us has to vote in our elections, whether it is municipal or state or federal. We have to vote for corporations. When the corporation sends, when we have invested in shares, we keep on getting voting mandates. We are expected to vote for directors. We are expected to vote for change of auditors, and we are expected to vote on key decisions. And we as shareholders can also bring resolutions that has to be voted upon, and we have to take active part and look at all those voting ballots that come to us from the companies that we have invested in. We can have a say in how environmental our company can be. We can have a say on whether or not our company is going to contribute to a political action committee or pursue a particular action, and thereby influence the company's attitude towards environment and attitude towards civil liberties and other things. We have the power to do that, but as a professional class of investors, we have been blindly following profits, and maybe it's time for us to change that. So that's one of the things that we can do. And when we try to do these things in anticipation of this, many companies have come up with different classes of shares. You have class of share that allows you to own and access to profits, but not to make decisions about the company. Many companies have promoters who hold the kind of shares that gives them absolute rights, and give only shares to shareholders for taking part in the profits, not in decision making. So those kind of companies can be shunned. It all depends on how greedy we are going to be, because typically those kind of companies are the ones that make a lot of profit, and they are the ones that are pushing legislation that are anti-environmental and mostly against our interests as general population. So we as shareholders have to decide where we are going to invest, and whether we are going to allow our politicians to bail out these corporations when they take risks beyond their means and then use our tax money to recover. So all the angst and everything that we feel as a citizen is basically rooted in a lack of proper governance, a lack of ethics in government, and lack of ethics in business. And we as individuals, if we don't ourselves have ethics, and if we don't teach our children ethics, and if we don't persevere against adversity to follow our ethics and live by principles, we are going to have unprincipled, unethical corporations supporting unprincipled, unethical politicians who will form unprincipled, unethical governments, which will get us into situations like this, where they will put band-aid solutions until the whole house of cards breaks down. So that's my 2 cents for today. Put in the comments what you think about it, and I'll meet you tomorrow with the technical analysis course. Bye for now. Have a great weekend.